Hi, I want to talk a little bit about our 2-day, 12-credit continuing education course on myofascial techniques for ribcage realignment. I think ribcage is really important. A lot of therapists don't really think too much about how it relates to everything else, and so I want to do a quick video showing how the position of the ribcage can really affect the position of the shoulders, especially the shoulder girdle, head forward or head backwards position, and even affect the pelvis and the feet and the knees. So to do this, I'm going to have one of our great staff therapists, Carl, jump in and replace me, and I'm going to do some work moving his rib cage around and have you see how it affects the rest of his body. So I'm going to roll that way, have Carl jump in frame. Hi. Okay, and then I'm going to have him actually start by turning sideways so you can see some of the planes really easily, because the biggest, most common plane that you're going to see with people is a posterior rib cage tilt at the top, meaning the rib cage goes that way. This often goes along with an anterior pelvic tilt, right? Because if you posteriorly pelvic tilted and still fell, you'd fall backwards, right? And so what happens a lot is our hip flexors get tight, sitting all day, pull our pelvis into anterior alignment. That makes us want to fall forward, and we compensate extending backwards, right? Obviously, this back extensors are firing like crazy right now. The other thing that will happen for balance is usually these start to fall forwards, and that starts to come forwards a little bit there, right? And you'll see a lot of this coming into your table. Basically, hips forward, rib cage backwards, heads forward, right? This is not very fun and will cause all sorts of neck and shoulder pain. Traps are super overstretched up here, but super tight down here. Pecs are going to be tight, pulling these around and forward. Serratus is going to be stuck. Right? And so we definitely want to lift the extensors, but if we only lift the extensors without dealing with some of the other things, we get some weird version like that, which is also uncomfortable. So the first thing we want to think about is slightly tilting the pelvis and the ribs like gears, right? And so if we want the ribs to stop being back here and bring them forward, we also want the pelvis to go along with it a little bit. And that gives a place for the shoulders to drop onto and rest like a yoke on the rib cage. It also really softens up the traps up here because it gives them slack. When they're here, they're overstretched and they're just going to be tight. Here, they've got some ability to be soft again. And so if I'm working on the table, or if you're working with your clients on the table and you're like, why won't these guys let go? Half the time it's simply because they're still stuck doing this on your table. And if you can just reposition the rib cage, the traps soften up without you having to do a bunch of work. The last thing you would definitely want to do is address the head forward part of this and release SCM and scalenes, and then suboccipitals. And you can really think of this as sourced as a bunch of hinge joints, like accordion folds. And so the ankle folds one way, the knee folds the other way, the hips fold another way, the mid-back folds a different way, the bottom of the neck folds a different way, and that folds, and just in opposite ways like that. And to get any one of those folds changed, you really have to unfold a few of them all together at the same time. And by doing so, you're going to find it much easier to get head, shoulder, neck issues to soften up without having to do a bunch of work up here, right? You just have to start with positioning the skeleton. All right, now we're going to position him to the front. So that was one plane, right? Just front to back, the tilt of the rib cage forward or backwards in space. With some clients, you're going to see some sideways tilting of the rib cage. hiking up one shoulder and having the neck shift off in the opposite direction. And for that, let's say I have a client who comes in like that, or some, less severe version of that. I'm probably going to stick them in side lying on the table, and I'm going to work on opening up and lifting all of that side fascia to rebalance. And that will get that shoulder to drop, right? Because if I do that there, well, for him, he's balancing by lifting this shoulder. It's totally fine. Some do one, some do the other. But by bringing this back on top of the pelvis and the feet, the shoulders get to relax and drop. The head gets to rest easier, right? The last plane that we'll talk about is a twist, right? And we talked a little bit about pelvic twists. The ribs often will do the opposite of the pelvis to balance. Like if I do that, eventually he's got to bring that back in space, or he's got to talk to you by side-eyeing you the whole time, right? Which some people do. Right? If I do this, he's got to go back the other way. Right? And so you really can think of the pelvis and the ribs as almost opposing gears. Whichever one moves one way, the ribs are going to move the opposite way. And so you want to think about rebalancing both at the same time. But the goal for all of it is that the rib cage sits on top of the pelvis, which sits on top of the knees, which sits on top of the ankles and the feet. And if you find that that's not happening, you're going to create stuff that we're going to work on. All right, cool.